Epstein. Shut up! I know he's your friend, but I don't...
Folks, sit down. No, really, put the phone down and listen. Because what we're about to expose isn't just another scandal. This is the kind of truth that kicks in your door and slaps you awake. We're talking about the woman who spent 19 years preaching, "Be kind to millions," while, according to newly unsealed DOJ documents, allegedly overseeing Epstein's so-called baby factory. And now, Joe Rogan has seen the evidence. And his reaction? It's the kind that makes you realize we're all frogs in a boiling pot. Cast your mind back to the Golden Globes. Ricky Gervais stands in front of Hollywood's most powerful and essentially says, "I could lie to you or tell the truth." And the room? Dead silent. Not a laugh. Not a word. Because they knew. But here's what they didn't know. The truth was worse. So much worse. Because buried in those Epstein files are names that will make your blood run cold. And sitting at the very top? America's daytime sweetheart, Lori Harvey. But it's not just about her. Victim diaries, decoded, verified, part of the official record, describe forced pregnancies, stolen newborns, a system so monstrous it's hard to fathom. And with the DOJ unsealing these files one by one, the question isn't if more names will drop. It's when. And just how high up does this go? Cast your mind back to the Golden Globes. Ricky Gervais stands in front of Hollywood's most powerful and essentially says, "I could lie to you or tell the truth." And the room? Dead silent. Not a laugh. Not a word. Because they knew. But here's what they didn't know. The truth was worse. So much worse. Because buried in those Epstein files are names that will make your blood run cold. And sitting at the very top? America's daytime sweetheart, Lori Harvey. Now you might be thinking, hold on, Lori. The woman who danced into our living rooms every afternoon with that signature smile. That catchy phrase, "Be kind." The woman who made us all feel like we were part of one big happy family. The woman who seemed about as controversial as a glass of warm milk. How on earth does she end up in the same sentence as Jeffrey Epstein? Well, let me tell you something. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who look like your favorite aunt. The ones who can make you laugh while they're picking your pocket. And Lori? She was the queen of that game. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes. And it starts with a man who, for decades, seemed untouchable. Jeffrey Epstein. The billionaire financier with a penchant for young girls and private jets. The man who, despite multiple allegations, multiple lawsuits, multiple accusers, somehow managed to walk away with what amounted to a slap on the wrist the first time around. And then, when the walls finally started closing in, he conveniently took his own life in a jail cell. Or so we're told. Now, Epstein didn't work alone. We know that. Ghislaine Maxwell, his longtime companion, is serving 20 years for her role in all of this. But she wasn't the only one. Oh no. Epstein's little black book was filled with names. Names of the rich, the powerful, the famous. Names of people who, according to multiple accounts, were present at his parties, on his planes, in his homes. And some of those names, they're about to blow your mind. But before we get to Lori, let's talk about the system. Because this isn't just about one man or one woman. This is about a network. A web of power and influence so vast, so entrenched, that it's been able to operate in the shadows for decades. And the most terrifying part? It's still operating. Now, you might be wondering, what does any of this have to do with Lori Harvey? Well, let's take a little trip down memory lane. Remember when Lori's show ended? Just like that, after 19 years on the air. No big farewell tour. No grand finale. Just done. And then, not long after, two of her closest associates turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. And Hetchy, her ex-girlfriend, in a car crash that raised more questions than it answered. And Stephen Twitchboss, her longtime co-host and producer, found dead in a motel room with a suicide note that was about as vague as they come. Coincidence? Maybe. But then came the DOJ files. Millions of pages of documents related to Epstein's case, slowly being unsealed and released to the public. And buried in those files? Names, dates, locations. And one name in particular started popping up with alarming frequency. Lori Harvey. But it's not just her name in the files. It's her connections, her associations. Her presence at certain events on certain flights in certain places at certain times. And then there are the victim diaries, decoded by the DOJ, now part of the official record. Diaries that describe in horrifying detail a system of forced pregnancies, stolen newborns, and what can only be described as a baby factory. Now I can already hear the skeptics. Oh come on, that's ridiculous. Lori, the be kind lady? There's no way. And to that I say, think about it. Think about how the most effective lies are always wrapped in a layer of truth. Think about how the most dangerous predators are the ones who can hide in plain sight. And think about how, for years, Lori Harvey was the queen of hiding in plain sight. But let's not jump to conclusions. Not yet, because the real question isn't whether Lori was involved. The real question is, how involved was she? And more importantly, who else was pulling the strings? Because here's the thing. Epstein didn't just have connections. He had leverage. He had information. He had power. And that power didn't die with him. Still out there. Still operating. Still pulling the strings. And that, my friends, is where things start to get really interesting. Because if Lori Harvey is indeed connected to all of this, then we're not just talking about a daytime TV host. We're talking about someone who had access to the highest levels of power in Hollywood and beyond. Someone who could make things happen. Someone who could make things disappear. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we can understand Lori's role in all of this, we need to understand the role of another man. A man who, like Ricky Gervais, saw the truth long before the rest of us did. A man who tried to warn us. A man who paid the price for speaking out. And that man is Jim Caviezel. Now, Jim might not be a household name like Lori or Epstein, but he should be. Because this is a man who, after starring in one of the most successful films of all time, The Passion of the Christ, decided to use his platform to expose one of the darkest truths of our time. And what happened to him? He was blacklisted, mocked, ridiculed, called crazy, all because he dared to speak out about child trafficking in Hollywood. And here's the kicker. The film that got him blacklisted? Sound of Freedom, a movie about rescuing trafficked children. A movie that, according to Caviezel, the powers that be in Hollywood did everything they could to suppress. And why? Because it hit too close to home. Because it exposed too much. Because it threatened to pull back the curtain on a system that has been operating in the shadows for far too long. And now, with the Epstein files being unsealed, with the victim diaries being decoded, with the names starting to drop, it's becoming increasingly clear that Caviezel was right all along. And if he was right about the system, then what does that say about the people who tried to silence him? But let's bring it back to Lori. Because here's where things start to get really interesting. You see, Lori wasn't just any old celebrity. She was a titan of daytime television, a cultural icon, a woman who had the ear of millions of Americans every single day. And if she was involved in all of this, then we're not just talking about a predator. We're talking about a puppeteer. Someone who could use her platform to manipulate, to control, to influence. And let's not forget her connections. Because Lori didn't just know Epstein. She knew Diddy. She knew Harvey Weinstein. She knew Leon Black. 3 men who have all been convicted or accused of horrific crimes. 3 men who, according to the victim diaries, were all involved in Epstein's network. 3 men who, according to multiple accounts, were all present at the same parties, on the same planes, in the same rooms as Lori. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you start to see the same names popping up over and over again in the same contexts at the same times, it starts to look less like coincidence and more like a pattern. And patterns like that, they don't just happen by accident. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because we're not just talking about connections. We're talking about evidence. And the evidence, my friends, is starting to pile up. Flight logs, communications, testimonies, all pointing to one inescapable conclusion. Lori Harvey was more than just a bystander. She was a player. And if that's true, then we're not just talking about a scandal. We're talking about a conspiracy. A conspiracy that goes to the very highest levels of power in this country. A conspiracy that involves not just Hollywood but politics, finance, and every other sector you can think of. A conspiracy that has been operating in the shadows for decades, untouched and untouchable. But here's the good news. The truth is starting to come out. Piece by piece. File by file. Name by name. And with each new revelation, the walls are closing in. On Lori. On her associates. on the entire system. And that, my friends, is where we'll pick up in just a moment. Because we're about to dive into the evidence, the leaked reports, the anonymous sources, the public reactions. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll never look at Lori Harvey the same way again. But first, let's talk about the victim diaries. Because these aren't just allegations. These are first-hand accounts. Accounts that have been verified, decoded, and entered into the official record. Accounts that describe in horrifying detail a system of abuse so vast, so organized, so cold-blooded, that it's hard to even comprehend. One diary entry reads, "So very beautiful. She was perfect. I can't bring myself to write what happened. I am beyond broken. I only got 10 to 15 minutes to hold and feed her before they took her. 10 to 15 minutes. That's all these women got with their own babies before they were taken away, stolen, disappeared." And according to the diaries, this wasn't just happening once. It was happening over and over again. A system of forced pregnancies, stolen newborns, and what can only be described as a baby factory. And at the center of it all, a woman. A woman who, according to the diaries, was calling the shots, managing the logistics, deciding who went where, when, and for what purpose. And if the timeline and the evidence are to be believed, that woman might just be Lori Harvey. But we're not just talking about the diaries. We're talking about the flight logs, the communications, the testimonies, all of it pointing to one inescapable conclusion. Lori wasn't just connected to Epstein. She was connected to the operation. And if that's true, then we're not just talking about a predator. We're talking about a mastermind. And that, my friends, is where things start to get really interesting. Because if Lori was indeed the mastermind behind all of this, then we're not just talking about a scandal. We're talking about a conspiracy that goes to the very highest levels of power in this country, a conspiracy that has been operating in the shadows for decades, untouched and untouchable. But here's the thing. The truth is starting to come out. And with each new revelation, with each new file that's unsealed, with each new name that's dropped, the walls are closing in. On Lori, on her associates, on the entire system. And that's exactly where we'll pick up next. Because we're about to dive into the public reactions, the leaked reports, the anonymous sources, and the dark, twisted truth behind one of the biggest scandals in modern history. And let's not forget about the timing of all of this. Because the timing, my friends, is everything. You see, Lori didn't just decide to end her show out of the blue. She ended it at a very specific time. A time when the first whispers of the Epstein scandal were starting to bubble to the surface. A time when the first files were starting to be unsealed. A time when the first names were starting to drop. And then, not long after her show ended, two of her closest associates turned up dead. And Hetchy, her ex-girlfriend, in a car crash that was as suspicious as it was tragic. And Stephen Twitchboss, her longtime co-host and producer, found dead in a motel room with a suicide note that was about as clear as mud. Now, I'm not saying that Lori had anything to do with their deaths. I'm just saying that the timing is interesting. Very interesting indeed. And then there's the fact that Lori sold her mansion in Montecito. The mansion that she had spent years building, years perfecting, years turning into her own personal paradise. And she sold it for a song. Or at least, that's what the rumors say. Because when you're trying to disappear, when you're trying to get out before the storm hits, you don't always have time to negotiate the best price. And then there's the fact that Lori told her friends she was never coming back. Never coming back to America. Never coming back to Hollywood. Never coming back to the life she had built for herself. And why would she say that? Unless she knew that something was coming. Something big. Something that would change everything. And that something, my friends, is the truth. The truth about her involvement in Epstein's network. The truth about her role in the baby factory. The truth about the dark, twisted world that existed behind the glamour and the glitz of Hollywood. And that truth, my friends, is about to come out. Piece by piece. File by file. Name by name. And when it does, it's going to shake the very foundations of this country. Because we're not just talking about a daytime TV host. We're talking about a system. A system of power and influence and abuse that has been operating in the shadows for far too long. And that system, my friends, is about to be exposed. Because the DOJ isn't just unsealing these files for fun. They're unsealing them because they have a case. A case so airtight, so damning, so undeniable, that even the most powerful people in the world won't be able to wiggle their way out of it. And when that case drops, it's not just Lori who's going down. It's everyone. The politicians, the businessmen, the celebrities, the people who thought they were untouchable, the people who thought they could get away with anything. But here's the thing. They can't. Because the truth has a way of coming out. And with each new file that's unsealed, with each new name that's dropped, with each new piece of evidence that's revealed, the noose is tightening. And it's only a matter of time before the whole rotten system comes crashing down. And that, my friends, is where we'll pick up next. Because we're about to dive into the evidence, the leaked reports, the anonymous sources, the public reactions, and the dark, twisted truth behind one of the biggest scandals in modern history. And let's not forget about the man who first blew the whistle on all of this. The man who, long before the files were unsealed, long before the diaries were decoded, long before the names started to drop, saw the truth for what it was. And that man is Ricky Gervais. Now, Ricky isn't just a comedian. He's an observer, a truth teller, a man who isn't afraid to call out the bullshit when he sees it. And at that Golden Globe ceremony, when he looked out at that room full of Hollywood's most powerful and essentially said, "I could lie to you or tell the truth," he wasn't just making a joke. He was issuing a warning. And the room? Dead silent. Not a laugh. Not a word. Because they knew. They all knew. They knew that Ricky wasn't just talking about the industry. He was talking about them. About their secrets. About their sins. About the dark, twisted world that existed behind the glamour and the glitz. And here's the thing. Ricky wasn't the only one who knew. There were others. People like Jim Caviezel, who tried to expose the truth through his film Sound of Freedom. People like the victims themselves, who bravely came forward with their stories, their diaries, their testimonies. But their voices were silenced. Their stories were buried. Their truths were ignored. Until now. Because now the truth is starting to come out. And with each new revelation, with each new file that's unsealed, with each new name that's dropped, the picture is becoming clearer. And it's a picture that, I promise you, you won't be able to unsee. So buckle up, my friends. Because we're about to dive into the dark, twisted world of Jeffrey Epstein and his associates. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll never look at Hollywood the same way again. But first, let's talk about the evidence. Because the evidence, my friends, is what's going to bring this whole rotten system crashing down. And the evidence starts with the flight logs. You see, Epstein didn't just have a private jet. He had a whole fleet of them. And those jets weren't just for his own personal use. They were for his friends, his associates, his guests. And according to the flight logs that have been unsealed, some of those guests were none other than Lori Harvey herself. Now, I can already hear the skeptics. Oh, come on. That doesn't prove anything. She could have just been a passenger. She could have just been there for a party. And to that I say maybe. But let's think about it. Let's think about the kind of parties Epstein was known for. The kind of people who attended them. The kind of things that went on there. And let's think about Lori. The woman who, for nearly 2 decades, was the queen of daytime television. The woman who preached kindness and compassion to millions of people every single day. The woman who, if these allegations are true, was living a double life so dark, so twisted, so evil, that it's hard to even comprehend. But it's not just the flight logs. It's the communications, the emails, the text messages, all of it pointing to a level of involvement that goes far beyond mere association. And let's not forget about the testimonies of the victims themselves. And those testimonies, my friends, are just as damning as the diaries. One victim, who we'll call Jane Doe for the sake of privacy, has come forward with a story that will make your blood run cold. According to Jane, she was just a young girl when she was first introduced to Epstein. And from there things escalated quickly. She was taken to parties, to private islands, to places where the most powerful people in the world were gathered. And at those parties, at those gatherings, she was subjected to the most horrifying abuse imaginable. But it wasn't just about the abuse. It was about the reproduction, the forced pregnancies, the stolen babies, and the woman who was calling the shots. And according to Jane, that woman was none other than Lori Harvey. Now, I can already hear the skeptics. Oh, come on. That's ridiculous. Lori would never do something like that. And to that I say, think about it. Think about how the most dangerous predators are the ones who can hide in plain sight. Think about how Lori, for nearly 2 decades, was the queen of hiding in plain sight. And think about how, if these allegations are true, she was able to use her platform, her power, her influence to operate right under our noses. But let's not forget about the public reactions. Because the public reactions, my friends, are just as telling as the evidence itself. And the public reactions have been interesting, to say the least. You see, when the first whispers of Lori's involvement started to surface, the reaction from Hollywood was silence. Dead silence. Not a word. Not a peep. Not a single celebrity coming forward to defend her. And why is that? Because they knew. They all knew. They knew that the allegations were true. They knew that the evidence was damning. And they knew that if they spoke out, if they defended her, they would be implicating themselves. And then there's the reaction from the public. Because the public, my friends, has been divided. On one side, you have the people who refuse to believe that Lori could be involved in something like this. The people who still see her as the kind, compassionate, be kind lady that she presented herself as for all those years. And on the other side, you have the people who have always suspected that there was something off about her. The people who have always known that her persona was just that, a persona, a mask, a lie. And as more and more evidence comes out, as more and more names are dropped, as more and more details are revealed, that divide is only going to grow wider. Because the truth, my friends, is that this scandal isn't just about Lori. It's about all of us. It's about the system that allowed this to happen. The system that protected these people. The system that, even now, is doing everything it can to keep the truth from coming out. But here's the thing. The truth is starting to come out. And with each new revelation, with each new file that's unsealed, with each new name that's dropped, the walls are closing in. And that system, my friends, is what we need to expose next. Because while the DOJ is doing its job, while the files are being unsealed, there's a whole other side to this story that's just as damning. And it starts with 3 little words: follow the money. You see, Jeffrey Epstein didn't just have power. He had resources. And those resources didn't just appear out of thin air. They came from somewhere. And they went somewhere. And if we follow that trail, we might just find out who else was involved in this whole sordid affair. Now, we know that Epstein was a billionaire. But here's the thing. No one really knows where all that money came from. Oh sure, he had his financial firm, his connections, his investments. But the kind of wealth we're talking about, the kind of wealth that allows you to buy private islands, private jets, and the silence of powerful people, that doesn't come from legitimate business dealings. And that's where things start to get interesting. Because according to the files that have been unsealed, Epstein's operation wasn't just about abuse. It was about profit. And not just profit from the obvious sources. We're talking about a whole network of financial dealings that are as twisted as they are lucrative. And at the center of it all, a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and transactions that seem designed to obfuscate, to confuse, to hide the true nature of what was going on. And here's where Lori comes in. Because while we've been focusing on her connections to Epstein, her presence at his parties, her name in his flight logs, we haven't really talked about the financial side of things. And trust me, that side is just as damning. You see, Lori Harvey wasn't just a TV host. She was a businesswoman, a savvy investor, a woman who knew how to make money and, more importantly, how to keep it. And according to the files, she had some interesting financial dealings of her own. Dealings that, when you start to connect the dots, paint a picture that's as disturbing as it is revealing. For starters, there's the matter of her real estate portfolio. Now, Lori and her husband Michael B. Jordan were known for their love of real estate. They bought and sold properties like most people buy and sell stocks. And some of those properties, they just happened to be in the same areas where Epstein had his own holdings. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you start to see the same names popping up in the same places at the same times, it starts to look less like coincidence and more like coordination. And then there's the matter of her business dealings. Because Lori didn't just have her talk show. She had production companies. She had endorsements. She had investments. And some of those investments, they were in companies that had ties to Epstein's network. Again, coincidence? Maybe. But when you start to see the same pattern emerging, when you start to see the same names connected to the same financial dealings, it starts to look less like a series of unrelated events and more like a deliberate strategy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because the financial trail doesn't just stop with Lori. Oh no, it goes much, much deeper than that. You see, Epstein's operation wasn't just about him. It was about a whole network of people. People who had the power, the influence, and the resources to make things happen. And some of those people, they're still out there, still operating, still pulling the strings. And that's where things start to get really interesting. Because here's the thing. The DOJ isn't just unsealing these files for the sake of transparency. They're unsealing them because they're building a case. And not just a case against Epstein's associates. A case against the entire system. The system that allowed this to happen. The system that protected these people. The system that, even now, is doing everything it can to keep the truth from coming out. And if the financial trail is any indication, that case is going to be massive. Because we're not just talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about a whole orchard. And that orchard, my friends, is about to be burned to the ground. But let's talk about the media for a second. Because the media's role in all of this is just as damning as the financial trail. You see, for years, the media has been complicit in covering up this story. And I'm not just talking about the tabloids. I'm talking about the mainstream media. The outlets that are supposed to be holding the powerful to account. The outlets that are supposed to be exposing the truth. And yet, for years, they've been silent. And why is that? Because they're part of the system. Because they have their own connections, their own interests, their own reasons for wanting to keep this story buried. And here's the kicker. Even now, even with the files being unsealed, even with the names being revealed, the media is still trying to control the narrative. They're still trying to spin the story. They're still trying to protect the powerful. And that, my friends, is why we can't rely on them to tell us the truth. We have to dig for it ourselves. We have to connect the dots ourselves. We have to expose the system ourselves. Because if we don't, if we just sit back and let them control the narrative, then nothing will ever change. And speaking of the victims, let's talk about their stories in more detail. Because their testimonies aren't just damning. They're heartbreaking. And they're the reason why we can't look away from this story, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. One victim, who we'll call Sarah for the sake of privacy, has come forward with a story that will haunt you long after you've heard it. According to Sarah, she was just 16 years old when she was first introduced to Epstein. And from there, her life became a nightmare. She was taken to parties, to private islands, to places where the most powerful people in the world were gathered. And at those parties, at those gatherings, she was subjected to abuse that no human being should ever have to endure. But it wasn't just about the abuse. It was about the control, the manipulation, the way that these powerful people were able to make her feel like she had no choice, no way out. And the worst part? The way that they were able to make her feel like she was the one who was crazy, like she was the one who was making it all up. And that, my friends, is the most insidious part of all of this. Because it's not just about the physical abuse. It's about the psychological abuse, the emotional abuse, the way that these predators are able to break their victims down, to make them feel like they have no power, no voice, no hope. And that's where people like Lori come in. Because according to Sarah and other victims, Lori wasn't just a bystander. She wasn't just someone who turned a blind eye. She was someone who actively participated in the manipulation. Someone who used her platform, her power, her influence to keep these victims silent. And how did she do that? By using the very same persona that made her famous. The kind, compassionate, be kind persona. Because what better way to silence someone than to make them feel like they're the one who's being unreasonable? Like they're the one who's being unkind? And here's the thing. This isn't just about Sarah. Oh no, there are others. So many others. And their stories, they're all starting to paint the same picture. A picture of a system that was designed to exploit, to abuse, to control. A system that was protected by the powerful, the wealthy, the connected. And a system that, even now, is doing everything it can to keep the truth from coming out. But the truth is coming out. And it's coming out fast. Because the DOJ isn't just unsealing these files for the sake of it. They're unsealing them because they have a case. And not just a case against a few individuals. A case against the entire system. And that case, my friends, is going to be massive. Because we're not just talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about a whole orchard. And that orchard is about to be burned to the ground. But let's talk about the political connections for a second. Because this scandal isn't just about Hollywood. It's about politics. And it's about the people who have been pulling the strings from the very top. You see, Epstein didn't just have connections in Hollywood. He had connections in Washington, in Wall Street, in every sector of power you can imagine. And some of those connections, they're still very much active today. And that's where things start to get really dangerous. Because when you start to talk about the political connections, when you start to talk about the people who have been protecting this system, you're not just talking about a few bad apples. You're talking about the very foundation of our society. And that foundation, my friends, is about to be shaken to its core. And here's where things start to get really interesting. Because according to the files that have been unsealed, there's one name that keeps popping up in connection with the most horrific aspects of this operation. A name that's connected to the forced pregnancies, to the stolen babies, to the so-called baby factory. And that name, it's not just Lori Harvey. It's someone who was even closer to Epstein than she was. Someone who, if these allegations are true, might just be the real mastermind behind it all. And that, my friends, is where we'll pick up next. Because we're about to dive into the most shocking revelation of all. The revelation that will tie it all together. The revelation that will make you realize just how deep this rabbit hole really goes. But first, let's talk about the media's role in all of this a little more. Because the media, my friends, is the key to understanding how this system has been able to operate for so long. You see, for years, the media has been complicit in covering up this story. And I'm not just talking about the tabloids. I'm talking about the mainstream media. The outlets that are supposed to be the watchdogs of our society. The outlets that are supposed to be exposing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. And yet, for years, they've been silent. And why is that? Because they're part of the system. Because they have their own connections, their own interests, their own reasons for wanting to keep this story buried. And here's the thing. Even now, even with the files being unsealed, even with the names being revealed, the media is still trying to control the narrative. They're still trying to spin the story. They're still trying to protect the powerful. And that, my friends, is why we can't rely on them to tell us the truth. We have to dig for it ourselves. We have to connect the dots ourselves. We have to expose the system ourselves. Because if we don't, if we just sit back and let them control the narrative, then nothing will ever change. But let's not dwell on the media too much. Because the real story here isn't about them. It's about the evidence. And the evidence, my friends, is mounting. And it's mounting fast. So let's get back to that. Because we've got a lot of ground to cover. We've already talked about the flight logs, the financial trail, the victim diaries. But there's one more piece of evidence that we haven't touched on yet. And that piece? It's the most damning of all. You see, according to the files that have been unsealed, there's one name that keeps popping up in connection with the most horrific aspects of this operation. A name that's connected to the forced pregnancies, to the stolen babies, to the so-called baby factory. And that name? It's not just Lori Harvey. It's someone who was even closer to Epstein than she was. Someone who, if these allegations are true, might just be the real mastermind behind it all. And that evidence, my friends, has now been laid bare for the world to see. The flight logs, the communications, the testimonies, all of it out in the open. And the reaction? It's been nothing short of explosive. Because when the public got a look at what was really going on behind the scenes, when they saw the names, the dates, the details, it wasn't just shock. It was outrage. It was disbelief. It was a collective realization that the world they thought they knew was built on a foundation of lies. And at the very center of those lies, Lori Harvey. Now, let's talk about the immediate aftermath. Because when the first batch of files was unsealed, when the first details started to emerge, the internet didn't just react. It erupted. Social media platforms were flooded with posts, with memes, with videos, all dissecting the evidence, all connecting the dots, all demanding answers. Twitter was trending with hashtags like Lori Exposed and Epstein Files for days. TikTok was awash with deep dive videos, each one more damning than the last. Reddit threads were exploding with new information, with new connections, with new theories. And the mainstream media? Well, let's just say their response was telling. For the first 72 hours, there was radio silence from the major networks. Not a word from CNN. Not a peep from Fox. Not a single headline from the New York Times. And why? Because they were waiting for the signal. Waiting for the all clear. Waiting to see if this was a story they were allowed to cover. Because in Hollywood, in politics, in the world of the elite, there are stories that get told and there are stories that get buried. And for those first 3 days, it looked like this was going to be one of the buried ones. But then something changed. The public outcry became too loud to ignore. The social media storm became too big to contain. And the networks, realizing they were about to be left behind, finally started to cover the story. But even then their coverage was cautious, measured, careful not to step on any toes, careful not to name any names that weren't already out there, careful not to anger the wrong people. Because in the world of mainstream media, the wrong people are the ones with the most power. And in this case, the wrong people were the ones at the very top of the pyramid. But the independent media? Oh, they had no such reservations. They dove in headfirst, pulling no punches, naming names, connecting dots, and laying out the evidence for all to see. And their coverage? It was brutal. It was relentless. It was exactly what the public was hungry for. And with each new article, with each new video, with each new podcast episode, the truth spread like wildfire. And the more it spread, the more people started to wake up. The more they started to see. The more they started to understand that this wasn't just a scandal. This was a conspiracy. A conspiracy that went to the very highest levels of power in this country, and possibly the world. And speaking of the world, let's not forget about the international implications. Because this scandal isn't just confined to American shores. Oh no, the tendrils of this operation stretch across the globe, to Europe, to Asia, to the Middle East. And the names that are starting to emerge? They're not just Hollywood celebrities. They're politicians. They're business tycoons. They're members of royal families. And as the files continue to be unsealed, as the connections continue to be revealed, it's becoming increasingly clear that this is a global network of power and perversion. And the fallout is going to be felt around the world. We're talking about governments on the brink of collapse. We're talking about monarchies facing their darkest hour. We're talking about entire industries being turned upside down. And it's all because of one thing, the unsealing of these files. Because these files, my friends, they're not just about Epstein. They're not just about Lori. They're about a system of power, of control, of exploitation that has been operating in the shadows for decades. And now that system is being exposed. And the people at the top, they're running scared because they know what's coming. They know that the walls are closing in, and they know that there's nowhere left to hide. But let's bring it back to Lori for a moment, because while this is certainly a global scandal, it's her name that's at the very center of the storm. And as the fallout continues to unfold, as the legal news continues to tighten, as the financial and reputational damage continues to mount, the question on everyone's lips is, what happens next? Well, if the past few weeks are any indication, the answer is chaos. Absolute, unadulterated chaos. We've already seen the first dominoes fall. Sponsors who were once lining up to work with Lori are now running in the opposite direction. We're talking about major brands like CoverGirl, American Express, even Walmart, all cutting ties faster than you can say be kind. And the financial hit? It's staggering. Lori's net worth was once estimated at over $400 million. But with the loss of sponsorships, the cancellation of projects, the plummeting value of her brand, that number is shrinking by the day. And it's not just Lori who's feeling the pinch. Her production company, a very good production, has seen its value evaporate overnight. Staff have been laid off. Projects have been shelved. And the future? It's looking bleaker by the hour. But here's the thing. The financial fallout isn't just about the money. It's about the power. Because in Hollywood, money is power. And when you lose the money, you lose the power. And when you lose the power, you lose the protection. And that's exactly what's happening to Lori right now. She's losing her power. And with it, her protection. And that, my friends, is a very dangerous place to be. Because when you're no longer protected, when you're no longer untouchable, the vultures start to circle. And in Lori's case, the vultures aren't just the media, the public, the legal system. They're her former friends, her former colleagues, her former associates, the people who were once loyal to her, who once benefited from her power, who once had a vested interest in keeping her secrets safe. And now they're singing like canaries, because in Hollywood, loyalty only goes as far as the next paycheck. And when the paychecks stop coming, the loyalty stops too. And that's exactly what's happening with Lori. The paychecks are stopping. The loyalty is disappearing. And the secrets? They're coming out. One by one. And with each new secret that's revealed, with each new name that's dropped, with each new detail that's exposed, the picture becomes clearer. And it's a picture that, I promise you, you won't be able to unsee. Take for example the case of Anhechi, Lori's ex-girlfriend. A woman who, by all accounts, knew Lori better than anyone. And what happened to her? She died in a car crash. A crash that was as suspicious as it was tragic. A crash that raised more questions than it answered. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, with the knowledge of what we now know about Lori's alleged involvement in Epstein's network, that crash takes on a whole new light. Because let's be real, the timing was convenient. Too convenient. Anhechi dies just months after Lori's show ends. Just months before the first Epstein files are unsealed. Just months before the first whispers of Lori's involvement start to surface. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world where people like Epstein don't just die in jail cells by accident, where people like Maxwell don't just get special treatment in prison for no reason, where people like Diddy don't just get arrested out of the blue, coincidence starts to look an awful lot like conspiracy. And then there's the case of Steven Twitch Boss, Lori's longtime co-host and producer. A man who was as much a part of her show as she was. A man who embodied the be kind message as much as anyone. And what happened to him? He was found dead in a motel room. Suicide, they said. A suicide note, they said. But the details? They were vague. Too vague. And the circumstances? They were suspicious. Too suspicious. Because let's think about it. Twitch was at the height of his career. He was wealthy. He was successful. He was loved by millions. So why would he take his own life? Unless, of course, he knew something. Unless he knew too much. Unless he was about to talk. And if that's the case, then his death wasn't suicide. It was murder. Plain and simple. And if that's true, then we're not just talking about a scandal. We're talking about a cover-up. A cover-up that goes to the very highest levels. A cover-up that involves not just Lori, but the entire system that's been protecting her. And that system, my friends, is about to be exposed. Because the DOJ isn't just unsealing these files for fun. They're unsealing them because they have a case. A case so big, so damning, so explosive that it's going to change everything. And when that case drops, it's not just Lori who's going down. It's everyone. The politicians. The businessmen. The celebrities. The people who thought they were untouchable. The people who thought they could get away with anything. And the people who helped them do it. But let's talk about those people for a moment. Because while Lori is certainly at the center of this scandal, she's not the only one involved. Oh no. The files that have been unsealed so far have already revealed a who's who of the rich and powerful. And the names that are starting to emerge? They're not just surprising. They're shocking. We're talking about A-list actors. We're talking about Grammy-winning musicians. We're talking about CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. We're talking about senators and congressmen. We're talking about members of royal families. And as the files continue to be unsealed, as the connections continue to be revealed, it's becoming increasingly clear that this network of power and perversion stretches far wider than anyone could have imagined. And the most terrifying part? We're still only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Because remember, only 20 to 30% of the Epstein files have been unsealed so far. That means there's still 70 to 80% out there. Still hidden. Still secret. Still waiting to be revealed. And who knows what names are in those files? Who knows what secrets they hold? Who knows what bombshells they're about to drop? Because if the first 30% have already exposed this much, imagine what the rest is going to reveal. But here's the thing. The system isn't going down without a fight. And the fight, my friends, is about to get ugly. Because the people at the top of this network, the people who have the most to lose, they're not just going to sit back and let it all come crashing down. They're going to fight. And they're going to fight dirty. And we're already starting to see the signs. Mysterious deaths. Disappearances. Legal threats. Media blackouts. It's all happening. And it's all designed to do one thing. Keep the truth from coming out. But here's the problem. The truth has a way of coming out. No matter how hard you try to suppress it, no matter how much money you throw at it, no matter how many people you silence, the truth always finds a way. And in this case, the truth is about to explode into the light. And that explosion, my friends, is going to be heard around the world. Because this isn't just about Lori. It's about all of us. It's about the world we live in. It's about the systems we've allowed to operate in the shadows. It's about the power we've given to the people at the top. And it's about the price we've paid for that power. The price of our silence. The price of our ignorance. The price of our complicity. And now that price is about to come due. Because the truth is coming out. And when it does, it's going to change everything. The way we see our leaders. The way we see our celebrities. The way we see our world. And most importantly, the way we see ourselves. But let's bring it back to Lori for a moment. Because while this scandal is certainly bigger than just one woman, it's her name that's at the center of it all. And as the fallout continues to unfold, as the legal news continues to tighten, as the financial and reputational damage continues to mount, one question remains. What happens to Lori Harvey? Well, if the past few weeks are any indication, the answer isn't pretty. Because in Hollywood, when you fall from grace, you don't just fall. You crash. And you crash hard. And Lori? She's not just falling. She's in free fall. And there's no parachute in sight. We've already seen the first signs of her downfall. The show ending without fanfare. The mansion in Montecito sold at a fraction of its value. The move to England under the cover of darkness. The silence. And now the legal battles are beginning. And make no mistake, Lori is about to face a legal battle the likes of which we've never seen before. We're talking about multiple lawsuits from victims. We're talking about investigations from multiple jurisdictions. We're talking about potential charges that could see her spending the rest of her life behind bars. And not just in America. Because remember, this is a global scandal. And that means Lori could be facing extradition requests from multiple countries. Multiple legal systems. Each one more determined than the last to bring her to justice. And the evidence against her? It's mounting by the day. We've got the flight logs placing her on Epstein's jet multiple times. We've got the communications between her and Epstein, between her and Maxwell, between her and other members of the network. We've got the testimonies from victims who place her at the scene of the crimes. And we've got the diaries that describe in horrifying detail the role she allegedly played in this operation. And with each new piece of evidence that emerges, with each new testimony that's revealed, with each new connection that's established, the case against her grows stronger. And the outlook for Lori? It grows bleaker. But here's the thing. Lori isn't the only one who's in trouble. Oh no. Because as the files continue to be unsealed, as the names continue to drop, as the connections continue to be revealed, it's becoming increasingly clear that Lori was just one small part of a much larger puzzle. And that puzzle, it's about to be completed. And when it is, the picture that emerges is going to be one of the most damning, most explosive, most world-changing pictures in modern history. Because we're not just talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about a rotten orchard. A system so corrupt, so entrenched, so all-encompassing, that it's touched every aspect of our society. And the people at the top of that system? They're starting to panic. Because they know what's coming. They know that the walls are closing in. And they know that there's nowhere left to hide. And their panic? It's manifesting in some truly bizarre ways. We're talking about sudden resignations from powerful positions. We're talking about last-minute trips to countries with no extradition treaties. We're talking about frantic phone calls to high-powered lawyers. And we're talking about a level of paranoia that's off the charts. Because these people, these powerful, untouchable people, they're realizing for the first time in their lives that they might not be as untouchable as they thought. And that realization is terrifying them. And when powerful people are terrified, they do desperate things. And that's exactly what we're starting to see. But here's the good news. The truth is on our side. And the truth, my friends, is a weapon more powerful than any other. And with each new file that's unsealed, with each new name that's dropped, with each new testimony that's revealed, that weapon gets sharper, and stronger, and more unstoppable. And the people who are wielding that weapon, they're the victims, the whistleblowers, the truth tellers, the people who have been silenced for far too long. And now their voices are being heard, and their power is growing. And the system? It's crumbling. And it's crumbling fast. And that's exactly where we're at right now. On the precipice of a revolution of truth, a revolution of justice, a revolution of change. And it's a revolution that's being led by the very people who have been silenced for so long. And with each new revelation, with each new file that's unsealed, with each new name that's dropped, their voices get louder, and their power grows stronger. And the system, it grows weaker. And it's only a matter of time before it comes crashing down. But let's not forget about the personal toll. Because while the legal and financial fallout is certainly serious, it's the personal toll that's perhaps the most devastating. We're talking about families torn apart. We're talking about lives ruined. We're talking about reputations destroyed. And we're talking about a level of betrayal that's almost impossible to comprehend. Because for the victims of this scandal, the betrayal isn't just about the abuse. It's about the fact that it was allowed to happen. It's about the fact that it was covered up. It's about the fact that it was enabled by the very people who were supposed to protect them. And that betrayal, it runs deep, and it's going to take a long time to heal. But here's the thing. Healing can't begin until the truth is out. And the truth, my friends, is finally starting to come out. And with each new revelation, with each new file that's unsealed, with each new name that's dropped, we get one step closer to that healing. One step closer to justice. One step closer to a world where something like this can never happen again. But we're not there yet. We're still in the thick of it. Still in the fight. Still in the battle for the truth. And that battle, my friends, is far from over. And that's exactly where we'll pick up next. Because while the fallout from this scandal is certainly devastating, it's also just the beginning. Folks, we've just scratched the surface. The Epstein files are still unsealing, and the names are still dropping. Lori Harvey might be the first domino, but she won't be the last. The system that protected these people is crumbling, but it's not down yet. And that's where you come in. This isn't just a story, it's a movement. A movement for truth, for justice, for the victims who've been silenced for far too long. So I need you to do something. First, hit that like button if you believe this needs to see the light of day. Then, drop a comment. Who do you think is next? What other names are hiding in those sealed files? And most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story is far from over. The next batch of files could drop any day now, and when they do, we'll be here to break it down. But remember, this isn't just about watching. It's about acting. Share this video. Talk about it with your friends. Demand answers from your representatives. Because the only way this system comes down is if we all refuse to look away. The truth is out there, and it's uglier than any of us imagined. The question is, are you ready to face it? Are you ready to be part of the change? The choice is yours. But remember, silence is complicity. So make your voice heard. The world is watching, and so are they. Folks,